Religious understanding. And what we do is we create safe spaces on campus for people to talk about relevant and often controversial social issues. So a lot of times when we bring up issues that can be controversial, it's difficult to really hear and understand what people are saying if you don't agree with them. And our goal is to create spaces where that's possible. And part of the way we do that is that we train students. So Dialogue Fellows, raise your hand. And ambassadors. And these students will be facilitating small group conversations halfway through the program, and you also will get a chance to share your ideas. So what are we here to talk about today? The topic is education, and this is a topic that we've been exploring throughout the semester. And today we are going to talk about what is quality education and who has access to it. So first, what do we mean by that? And once we figure out what it is that a quality education is everybody able to get that? And why is it difficult for certain people to get that? That education, and how can we change that? And this is, as many social issues, this is not something that we can look at from one perspective. This is something that is a policy issue. It's an issue for academics. It's an issue for psychologists. It's an issue for principals and for school teachers. It's an issue for students. It's an issue for parents. So we've brought all of you here today, people from different perspectives, and have something unique to offer to this conversation. So right now I'm going to hand it over to our wonderful panelists. Thank you so much for joining us to explore and come up with some possible solutions to this difficult issue. So I'm going to ask each of you, before we go into these questions, to just say a little bit about who you are, what you're doing, and why education is important to you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and to engage in this conversation today. My name is Limarys Caraballo, and I'm a professor here at Queens College in the English Education program in the Department of Secondary Education and Youth Services. My research specifically looks at the ways in which students experience education, the way students experience academic contexts, by paying particular attention to how they construct identities in the context of academic environments. And I then look at how those identities and the ways in which they sort of see themselves in school and in the curriculum interacts with their experiences of the curriculum and their achievement. And I bring that work to my present work as an English teacher educator in our program. And education is important to me because it has meant so much in my own life. It has opened many doors for me and shaped me in many ways. And the more that I became aware of the role of my education in my life, the more I became interested in studying what it does to all of us and what it does for all of us. So that's kind of what brings me to this conversation. So I'll pass this on.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Carrie Sanchez. I am an assistant principal at Forest Hills High School, which is a local high school in Queens. I've been a teacher and assistant principal later, but for the last 22 years. And my role in the school is as the assistant principal of social studies. So the ideas of social justice and quality education and meeting the needs of students in a real fashion in real time is pivotally important. And I've been involved in projects with Queens College and other institutions for many years. As a graduate of Queens College, I'm committed to programs like this and hope to bring these experiences, both what I learn and our students here, to events like this. I think education is important to me because like my colleague said, it's done so much for me, for my family, and the different paths that I could have taken, or different members of my family, and then to take that knowledge and see my students and the worlds that open for them, and to hear back from them after their years through high school, through college, goes to show the successes and the sadness of when the successes aren't there, when they're blocked. And so I think tonight's conversation is important to that, and that's why I'm here. Oh, you have one, okay.
Good evening. So I'm Warren Spielberg. I'm an associate professor at the New School in New York, psychology. I'm a psychologist. So I'm an educator in the sense I'm a teacher at the university, but my field is psychology. And I come at the issue from two particular vantage points. One, my colleague and I just finished here I have it here, a 2-volume book. It's for sale at your local Barnes & Noble. It's called The Psychology of Black Boys and Adolescents, 2 volumes. There was a lot of work in education. We did a study, a 10-year study, qualitative study, talking to boys of color, listening to their voices. So much of what they had to say centered on their experiences in school. And that's how I think I mainly got interested in professionally. And then, and I'll talk about it as we go along. The other issue is I'm also a clinical psychologist, as I said, and I work, I have a practice. And I recently was talking to a patient, and she's quite accomplished, but she told me a very interesting story, which I'll make it shorter. Basically, she went to school here in New York as a young child, and then she moved to Washington, D.C. when she was in high school. And she came from a highly educated African-American family, and who were so supportive of education and supportive of her. But she gets to, and she did very well in New York City, in the Brooklyn School District she was in. It was a good district. But she gets down to Washington, D.C., and within the space of 6 months, her grades have dropped. She doesn't like school anymore. She's almost dropping out. She starts doing some minor substance abuse. The point being, that what happened in one social environment was decent and supportive, and in the other social environment, another school system, which was toxic, and which took a woman like, a young girl like her, a brilliant person, and then basically so dissuaded her from education that it was mind-boggling to me. So I think that's the question we have today before us about quality, access to quality education, but it means that it has many different variables. I'm sure we'll be able to discuss them. Okay, I look forward to the discussion. Thank you for having me.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
All right, great. My name is John Duval. I work for the Department of Education, where I oversee a range of high school innovation initiatives. I think the one that's most relevant to this conversation is something called the Expanded Success Initiative, or ESI, which was part of the former administration, Mayor Bloomberg's Young Men's Initiative, thinking to address educational inequity for Black and Latino youth, boys specifically. And so that's, I'm happy to speak to that or answer questions about it as the evening unfolds. I think, education, why is it important? I think as a first-generation American, I was, still am to a certain degree, I think a big believer in meritocracy, although less so than I used to be, and still find education, at least the way I perceive things, to be still the most expedient way for to level the playing field for social justice regions and social mobility. And so that's the reason I work in education every day. And yeah, that's about it.
It is my distinct pleasure to serve as moderator and panelist this evening. So I will sort of guide our discussion by focusing our comments on the specific questions that have been raised for this panel and for our dialogue later on. So our first question that we should all respond to in roughly 4 minutes or so is, what is quality education in our view and from our different perspectives? What does that mean and what does it look like? Who wants to go first?
Oh, want to start you?
Sure.
Okay. I'll try and be succinct about this. You know, without getting into great philosophical discussions or debates about this, you know, I think a quality education is one that prepares young people for full participation in American civic life, economically, socially, politically. I don't think, and however many other ways you want to cut that. I will say that I think to a certain degree, one of the issues that sort of precludes that is I think we've begun to scope what education means in very, very, very narrow terms. And that has a lot to do with, you know, system reform and accountability regimes and things of that nature. And, you know, there are many reasons why people would argue for or against those things. But in general, I think there's a lot of emerging research that's talking about the different set of skills that young people graduating from high school and college specifically need to thrive in the workforce these days. And I don't think those are a set of skills or domains mostly related to social emotional learning skills, how we collaborate, how we work in teams, that I think are proving really valuable, right, after high school these days. And I don't think we've actually necessarily framed quality education including some of those other skill sets as well. And so I think in a very, you know, easy way, sure, quality education needs to include both the academic and social emotional sort of learning skills that kids need to thrive after high school and in college and in the labor force. And then one, I think that ultimately also helps young people, you know, with domain identity formation, understanding who they are as a person and where they see themselves in any range of contexts, be it in their current high school, where they will, you know, how they visualize and identify themselves in a college setting and in the labor force going forward.
Thank you. Okay. Would you like to go next? Sure.
Can you hear me if I don't hold it? Are we good? Okay. So I think I'm going to hit many of the similar strands to what my colleague just said. I think at my level we discuss it a lot as college and career readiness, or the terms that we probably have all heard. And I think that's true to a degree. We want our children to see themselves in a future that maybe they wouldn't naturally, that we want them to see themselves successful and being successful in a college setting, in a career setting. But I think that a quality education is much more broad than that. It's not a set of skills labeled A through E, that if you can do these things, then you're ready and you're a student. I think it's a much deeper conversation, which is hard to quantify and measure, which is some of what's going on in education now as we look for different ways to assess and critique. But if we think about the challenges of citizenship in a digital world, in the political world, and in an economic world that's constantly changing, and that students, more so than ever before, will need to be able to see those challenges and adapt to them, not fall prey to settling for things, both personally and in the political world, and rise to challenges. And so when I think about readiness and quality, I think about their ability to think critically, to search deeper, to not accept one perspective, even if it's the one they hold deeply. And so those things are harder to teach, they're harder to measure, but if we're talking real quality, I think that's where we're headed. And so that when students see the potential in themselves and that future path, that it's going to open up even more doors.
All right, so first and foremost, I think a quality education is a place for where young children can go and feel safe and attached, very simply. And children who do not seek successful attachment in schools become punished or disaffected, alienated. And then there's attachment it's a pretty simple idea. The psychologists, we tend to make it more complicated. There's a whole field of attachment research and theory. There's secure attachment, insecure, dissociated attachment, confused attachment, but basically I'll make it simple, securely attached. So where you feel basically cherished, held in the minds of others in a positive way. In your mind, you can locate yourself in the teachers, school administrators, your peers in a positive way. You think that they think well of you. You feel safe. And then after that, you can learn and you can think. There's a concept we call reflective functioning, which means basically being able to think about yourself and then about others, and then about more higher order thinking. But this is all dependent on not being anxious, not being confused or hurt or feeling rejected, feeling accepted, feeling understood. I think it's simple, but it's important. I think it's important to say. And then there's critical thinking, which is learning to think about thinking and how to think, and metacognition. And I think in today's world, we don't really know, do we, what the next fields are going to look like, the next professions. But being able to problem solve and think, and just in my other life, I also teach at Al-Quds University on the West Bank, and the professor there, the president, and now he's stepped down, but Sari Nusseibeh, he was a philosopher, when he revamped the educational program there over the course of 20 years, especially in the last 5 years, in association with Bard College, he developed a program in critical thinking. So, Palestinian education tended to be very routinized and oriented toward learning facts and things, not so unlike, many places in our country. And he decided to revamp the curriculum to make it around critical thinking, and it's had huge impact and huge success. So those are some of the ideas that come to the top in my head.
And so wearing my panelist hat, I think I would really, I would echo a lot of what has already been said, but rather than repeat it, I think I would add that in addition to the ideas regarding the kind of space that a quality education should provide, and the cultivating multiple perspectives and having different roles in society, promoting justice, I see quality education as very much a process, as what Paulo Freire has talked about as the process of conscientization. So the idea of constructing a consciousness, not having it be handed to students, not necessarily developing an awareness that comes from somebody else's understandings, but sort of constructing their own understandings about themselves, as colleagues have mentioned, but also of the ways in which systems and processes work in society, the ways in which their culture works, and the ways in which other cultures and perspectives are developed. And I think that that's a really key element in a quality education, because it leads us away from that routinized process of learning facts and skills, and then not necessarily being able to think about what comes next, what is yet unknown. So I would think I would be happy for my own child to have the privilege and the right to a quality education that prepares him or her to address the unknown and sort of construct the future. So now, building upon these definitions that these very lofty definitions that we have created for ourselves here, of what a quality education is, then who has or doesn't have access to such a quality education? And this is a multi-part question. We are asked to reflect on who has or doesn't have access, why those groups or persons do or do not have access, and then what are the challenges to providing access. And if we have anyone who would like to start. I can start on this one to vary the order of things. Okay. So building upon my own research interests with respect to how students construct identities in academic places, I'm particularly interested in students of color and students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds or historically marginalized groups. And so what I have noticed in my research and what I have learned from the research that has been done by others is that typically it is particularly students from these groups that have the most difficulty accessing quality education. And in some cases, when quality education is conceptualized as a particular set of resources, even when those resources are provided, students who are somehow on the margins of mainstream society for whatever reason, whether it be class or race or gender identity or religious beliefs, these are the students who have the most difficulty accessing quality education. And so I think the reason for that is very, very complex and very, very simple at the same time. I think the simple part is that there's our systems, social systems, tend to want to perpetuate themselves, and the status quo helps to perpetuate whatever system it is, and education is one of many such systems. And so being different from the norm or the mainstream, or whatever is dominant in any institution, is already a reason to sort of block access. And then the complex parts have to do with what is required to provide access or opportunity to particular groups, because the needs are always different depending on context and depending on who we're working with. And so that also becomes a challenge. How do we define the needs for quality education in different groups, contexts, and communities? And then how do we provide in general something that is so local and so particular? So I think that those are some of the challenges beyond the obvious need for resources, which are so great and often lacking. And so that would be my answer for now.
I'll build on that and would echo all, and I'm thinking about, again, building on what you're saying, and also speaking to what you said before about the need to feel safe and how simple it is, but how complex that can be. And I think that's one of the impediments to a quality education is a lack of feeling safe, however we define that. I don't know if it's just physical safety, although for some students it is that, but it can also be emotional, and am I willing to share with others, to accept things about myself? So there's those levels of blocks, and so it's simple, and yet in the classroom, in the school, it's very complex to deal with those issues. And we want to see the challenges and group them, but you're right, the approach has to be differentiated, which makes that a difficult task. I think if I asked my colleagues or some of my teachers about this question, their first response might be access to resources. If we just had more things, then we would be equal, and then the quality would be the same. And maybe a simplistic answer, and certainly I would not turn a resource down, but I don't know if that's necessarily the answer. And there's also an entire community piece that comes outside of the school and the world of education completely. And as we as we think about the impediments don't start at the schoolhouse gate. They start long before. And so the challenge of investigating where those impediments are for each community and for each group, whether it be racial or ethnic or L status, or students with learning disabilities or emotional disabilities, or with families who did not go to college and don't have the same experience with the education system, they're coming to us with this range of experiences. And I think that's one of the challenges, is schools don't necessarily know how to engage back with the community. We're deeply connected, we're embedded with the community, but we're not always so good at the conversation in both directions, or at listening, making those connections, even when we're trying, even when the struggle is real. I don't know how good we are at having and being able to recognize all those issues that are coming in.
So I'm going to take a sort of a macro lens and move more specifically, but excuse me. So first, there are structural factors that prevent access to quality education, and these are broadly poverty and poor housing, exposure to violence, children exposed to violence, poor nutrition, poor access to health care. These are all associated with poor educational outcomes and access to education. I'll just take a couple. Poverty, but children who are poor have much less exposure, for example, to language. By age 4, they have heard, according to one stat, 30 million less words than their middle class or upper middle class counterparts. There's lots of reasons for that, and being poor means you also have lack of access to time with parents because they're working and trying to keep their head above water. You have less access to study materials, internet, place to study even in a crowded apartment, and a million other factors that are all kind of commingled. Children who are exposed to violence, they are traumatized, they cannot learn. In my practice, I once worked with a young boy. I won't go into the whole story, but he was a foster care kid. He had been abused. He was about 8 years old. He had been abused, and then one day, unfortunately, but maybe fortunately as it turned out, because he ended up in a good foster care and then was adopted. But he was abandoned in Grand Central during rush hour. So this is the kind of history the kid had. So he comes in. So the agency. I was chief psychologist at an agency at the time, and we tested him. His IQ was 56. A year later, after treatment, and a year later after being in a better home, his IQ was 120, and he was functioning at school. And all these limited access to health care, poor nutrition, affects our 0 to 3 populations the most. And that's where we get the start for our cognitive selves as 0 to 3. Brain development is beginning. Concentration, memory, overall aptitude will suffer. Now, many kids have individual resilience, and there's a whole kind of American ethos about resilience. But if you pile up all those risk factors, the ones I mentioned, there's no kid that's going to survive that and be able to go to school and learn. There's also cultural impediments to quality education. And I would first and foremost, unfortunately, put the concept of masculinity as we construct it in this culture as an impediment. Because still there's a kind of an anti-intellectual element to a lot of masculinity. Boys are doing worse in school. Girls are doing better. Why? It's sort of, we can have a whole discussion about it. But one factor is on a Friday night, let's say in a small town in Texas, You have thousands of people turning up. What? Why? It's a football game. Try to get them on a Wednesday night for a PTA meeting. And there's tons of research showing, which comes to my next topic about, culturally, single parenthood is a risk factor. Fathers are important. So some of the research, interestingly, especially on educational outcomes, a child, a boy, for instance, who has a father who goes to the PTA meeting, does much better in school. Now, it's not just because the father went to the PTA meeting. He didn't learn the secret to life at the PTA meeting. But it correlates to the boy. He says, oh, it's important. It's important that I do well in school. Plus the discipline and other things fathers do. And now, I just, culturally, Moynihan, people know that Daniel Moynihan wrote a report about in the late 60s about in the African American family, that there was a crisis emerging. What was the crisis then? About 35% of young boys were being raised in households without fathers, single-parent families. You know what the figure is now? Anybody? I'm not doing Q&A yet, but I'll just answer. So it's 73%. So, it's not just the psychological variables that fathers do, but it's also, 2 pair of hands, there's extra income, it's a lot of things all together. There are certain cultural attitudes about learning that come from particular groups. John Ogbu, who was an anthropologist, has studied the African American community, African American boys in particular. He notes that there's kind of a trend of resistance to education, as a generalized resistance to institutions of domination. So this is one way of resistance, is not to go to school, not to do well in school. And then finally, and we could talk more about it, but our study with African American boys and some of the research on African American boys. First of all, about over 55% of African American boys do not graduate with their peers. The high school dropout rate doubles. It's getting better. It's gotten better actually over the years, but it's still 2 to 3 times higher than that with their white counterparts. 80% of kids in special education are Black or Latino males. Teachers routinely, according to the research, have much lower expectations of African American boys, and they rate them as more oppositional, defiant, or dangerous than white counterparts for the same kind of behaviors. And of course, the worst factor is the huge disparities in suspension and expulsion rates. If you're a Black boy, you have about 25 to 30% chance of being suspended or expelled. And once that happened, that halves your chance of going to college, and it cuts down by 1/3 your chance of finishing high school. So, and in our book, we interviewed boys, and I'm probably coming to the end of my time. Okay? So basically, they all report, the boys report things like always being put in the back of a class, always, if there was a fight or argument with a white boy, they would be getting in trouble, not the white boy, that they were felt disliked in general by the teachers, and they generally many closed their minds to school at a very early age. By the way, this thing I said about the cultural, John Ogbu's work, on he studied later adolescence, middle adolescence, but by 3rd grade, African American boys are pulling out of school. That's when their test scores and their work drops by 3rd grade. So that's 8 years old, roughly. So no 8-year-old says, school ain't cool, I ain't going. I don't know, do any 8-year-olds just talk like that? No, they don't. But they do become depressed, they do withdraw, they do mentally leave the school space. And by the way, the worst thing that we found in our study was that boys were, when they did well, they were accused of cheating. And how do you cope with that? How do you cope with that? I can talk a little bit about it when I come back. But basically, schools are not welcoming, accepting, or helpful to a large number of African American boys across class. This is not just a class issue. It's middle class boys report this, and there's many kinds of results that occur from this. So I think, but I mean, let me let John talk and then we come back.
Who has or doesn't have access to quality education? This is going to sound a little bit strange. I would say actually there's a lot of people who don't have it across the board, and I think a lot of times what we see as a proxy for quality education are actually just places that are serving a lot of students that have access to social capital and replicate those same sort of structures again and again. And so I guess I'll answer that question by asking everyone here, the audience question, who here can remember their favorite teacher? Who here can remember their favorite 10 teachers? Their favorite 20 teachers? Right, you can. I'll tell you why. Because teaching and learning is actually really, really hard. It's actually really, really hard. And so for any of you who are here who were at the new school 2 weeks ago, I'll tell the same story I told then. Really briefly, which is I actually volunteered to teach a class on Thursday afternoons at a new high school that we opened as part of ESI last September. And the long and short of it, I don't get into it, is that the class is horrible. It sucks, right? I thought I would get in there because I'm trying to do teaching and learning in a different sort of way. It's competency based. We can talk about a range of different sort of high school innovation things later. The bottom line is it's awful, right? It's a terrible class. No kids like it. And I talked to a young man afterwards about why it was good or not good, and he basically said he was bored out of his mind. I was trying to teach a social justice elective. We were focusing on the murder of Emmett Till, right, which happened 60 years ago. He was like, it's bored, I don't care about it. It's boring, I don't care about it, it means nothing to me, right? And I think, it illustrates something that is actually very, very complicated about what goes on inside education classrooms today, right? Which is a number of things are happening with breakneck speed. One, can I deliver something to a group of 25 young people that's interesting to them? Two, is what is my interaction with them, right, based on maybe they're 14 and they're rejecting authority as sort of forming their own identity? Or two, is there something that I'm doing that is implicitly biased against who they are as a young person because they could be black or brown? Right? And three, by the way, is Emmett Till on the Readiness exam later this year, and should I even be teaching this right now, or should I be teaching something else that's going to hold me accountable for the policy environment at the end of the year, right? That is what's happening in real time inside a classroom, inside of every classroom in New York City. So think about how complicated that actually is. It is actually really hard. And so when people say, who has access to quality education, the reason I would say people can remember their favorite teacher is because that's going to sound horrible. Teaching is really hard. There actually aren't spectacular teachers in every single classroom. What other field, right, has spectacular people at every single level of it? No, there are great people at it, there are people that are struggling at it, and there are people that are not good at it, right? And so somehow we have this myth and this expectation around quality education, like every single classroom I go into should have the best person ever as a teacher that's in there. Well, this is not, when you took a stats class, that's not normal distribution. That's not actually how it works, right? And so, in some senses, I think there's a weird sort of expectation we have around how, around quality education and what it should look like for every single kid in every single classroom. That being said, what are the challenges? I do think that we spend a little bit too much time on things we probably shouldn't be spending time on. That sounds a little bit kind of might be heretical to some people because I think everybody sort of plugs into a school or a classroom in the education space says, no, this thing that we're focusing on is the most important thing in someone's education. And someone over there is like, no, this thing is the most important thing. And at some level, what we're not doing on a regular basis is actually asking young people what is the most important thing in their education, right? And actually wrapping our time, space, schedule, human capital around the needs of young people versus around the needs of adults to either A, feel comfortable doing something that they are okay at, to sort of hide people from the possibility of failure, which seems impossible for us to wrap our brain around. I have no idea why, quite frankly, since everyone in this room probably at some point in time has learned repeatedly through failure. But somehow in our kind of politicized education environment, the idea of failure is a disaster and not conscionable. And so I think there's some cultural things, right, that preclude access to quality education. It's very hard for us to begin to articulate what quality is because we're not willing to accept failure. And then I just think in general the job is very hard, and so we really need to think about ways to reorganize human capital and use technology to think about spreading the expertise of some of our best-in-class teachers in very non-traditional ways. Very hard to do with a city geographically as large as New York, but it's, I have the conversation with some colleagues sometimes, which at the heart of it, right, while schools are also instances where we're trying to grow and nurture young people, they're also actually IT companies, right? What is happening inside of a school? There's information, right, that's trying to be transferred from someone to someone else in terms of a learning mode. And so the IT revolution has upended everything else. Can we actually begin to think about education in schools more in that frame of mind and begin to borrow methods and ways that people organize IT type things to actually provide access, right, to education in a different way that might be threatening to some, but might be in the best interest of young people. And so that's what I'll say about that one.
Well, I think that we're doing well on time to address our third question with the time allotted. So now our third question is, given these challenges that we have heard about in some detail, how could we expand access to quality education? How would we go about that? And someone else should be first.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first this time.
Great.
So I thought about this in a few ways, and I think I would start with who's in the classroom at whatever level you're on. There's no panacea, but thinking about teacher training and teaching being a reflective process. Not everybody is going to be the teacher of your life, right? I had Ms. Frazier, foundational, wonderful, unbelievable, and there are a few of them. But how can we create systems to ensure that the worst are not? They have different career options, perhaps, and that the rest can challenge on most days. I heard somebody refer to teaching kind of in a disparaging way, and it was a teacher like, we're just here to entertain, and I thought that's such a bad way to think about it, because that's not what this should be about. It's not about entertaining students, it's about exciting them, and there's a world of difference, and I think so many think it's the same thing, but it's trying to create that intrinsic excitement and help pull it out for the students. And so continual development, challenge, supervision, discussion, peer-to-peer work, going out into the greater world as professionals and learning from each other and exploring those things. So I think that's a key, because that's going to help spread some of the quality, not make up for other things, but certainly that's a point. I think we need to definitely improve connections between school and community, particularly with parents. We're having parent-teacher conferences this week, and one of the things you will hear from the teachers is, we're seeing the parents we don't need to see, quote unquote. And that may be true, right? You have, yes, oh wow, they did all their homework, and they, look, your daughter did pass all these tests, and she's grown, and she participates. And we had, and should have conversations around the fact that the reason that maybe we don't need to see them is because they come. Because those are the parents that are coming, and they came in first grade, and they're coming in 12th grade. And even though they're graduating, they're in front of us one more time, because they want to hear how their child is doing, because they're going to go home, and they're having many, many microscopic conversations around that not just are happening on parent-teacher conference night. How do we make that connection better so that more parents can come? Some are structural changes with parents that are working all the time. How do we open our doors in non-traditional ways so that they can come? How do we cross cultural boundaries? We have a large parent population that does not feel comfortable with institutions. They are from other countries where you don't engage. You don't go to the school that would be seen as disrespectful, questioning how do we cross those cultural and national divides. So there's a lot of questions there, but certainly we need understanding, connections in and our understanding out, and consistent support for growth, recognizing that growth takes time, and in year 2 your graduation rate's not going to go from 30% to 80%, and you did it. You fixed everything. Thank you very much. I always think about some of the famous television shows that we say, oh, it was, NBC forgot Seinfeld, and then it became this great thing. And I think that if sometimes, in some places, if they just forgot the school for a year or 2, not really, but just let it grow and let it stumble, it could just get enough footing so that it could continue, and give the support, and don't give up on an idea that's good, because the results are not going to be instant, because of all the things we spoke about that are the impediments are deep and long and historical, and so the solution is going to be deep and long, and so we have to come to that. So those would be some of my things to expand access so that more experience it.
So, trying to address the 3 topics I mentioned, structural, cultural, and racial. So, beginning with the first, structural. So, when you're dealing with children, talking children in poverty, it has to be a multimodal, a large-scale intervention on the scale that we have not seen for a long time in our culture, but is done in specific places like the Harlem Children's Zone, where you're targeting, income, jobs, quality pre-K, parent programs, and they have a huge, the Harlem Children's Zone, run by Jeff Canada, has had a huge influx of money. The other program now going on that's similar, not as wealthy, is, I think, Bronx Rising, right? Bronx Rising. The other program. So that's structurally, I think we have to have kind of a Marshall Plan for dealing with children in poverty, and the education is a piece of it. Culturally, I think masculinity is an area for me of inquiry and intervention to reframe again for boys. That the typical role model boys are still growing up with. Which is sort of anti-intellectual, which is sort of, be good at fighting, don't cry, don't be dependent, and be successful at something that makes money, has to be re-altered and re-changed and interrogated over and over and over again for the next 100 years. In terms of racial bias in schools. So, teachers, I think John has sort of alluded to, or we don't have to have John just say it. We know teachers are decent people. They're better than most of us. They have hard jobs. They need a lot of support. They have to do 1.5 million things. And, we don't want to necessarily have to add this piece to their lives, but we have to. The idea that we have to help them deal with their implicit bias, but do it in a creative, sensitive way, and things that my partner have done in particular schools and other people have done, that in ways that get them to think about their own identity culturally, to build empathy for other identities, to help them become aware of their biases, to plan supervised intergroup contact with other members of other groups in a non-threatening, non-professional way, to provide counter-stereotypic training, exercises that can undo stereotyping. First you have to help them see their stereotype, and then you can help them kind of think about it and try to undo it and grapple with it, and providing them a greater emotional space just to be able to talk about their job, to even ask a question, and that most of them don't have the time to think about. How do you think we can improve the education of this group in our school? It's not, obviously, my research has been with African American boys. It's not they're not the only group that's doing poorly. By the way, African American girls are struggling. They're doing better educationally, but Kim Crenshaw's work is on the psychological costs that they face is very important. I'm not saying we could deal with one group at a time. There's plenty of money if we could spend it, and plenty of time to think about helping many different groups. I think every school should develop its own plan for reducing teacher bias and doing some research around, and ask them to come up and grapple with this particular plan. And I know this, stereotypes can be changed. Thoughts can be altered. If I asked you in 1958, about African Americans, you would have, 80% would have said, well, they're inferior intellectually. Now that number is still too high, close to 10%, but it's still a shame, but it's improved. And we can improve this among ourselves and among teachers. And I think we have to, because we have to improve the relationship they have with boys of color.
All right. Ooh, that's toughy. Yeah, so you're not going to get out here without me actually commenting on the structural racism side of it as well. I think the one thing though is it's attention to balance. When we talk about the context in which a lot of schools find themselves, which is in generally high poverty neighborhoods with little infrastructure around them, is that as soon as we begin to think about more holistic strategies to begin to address, right, the range of things around young people, whether it's their mental health or poverty or access to a job after school for either themselves or for the parents to meet a living wage. I think those things are all very important. That being said, I think there is a real balance to strike between that being the conversation and the conversation being around what is it that teachers do, right, to Warren's point earlier, that makes a young person, a young black boy, for example, so disaffected by the third grade that they don't want to go to school anymore. And that actually is something that is at the point of service, that is about a teacher interacting with a young person, and it happens at all levels of our educational system. And once we begin to have conversations around the myriad set of challenges that are in a community around a school, it's very easy to begin to remove the locus of accountability from what schools are actually doing day to day, to also, I would say, reinforce the same sort of institutional barriers that they're running into when they leave the school, right? And that's it's a very hard balance to strike, and I'm not against, for example, a more coordinated set of services that are wrapped around young people, right, in terms of other city agencies coming together, which is part of, the ESI, the thing I work on, is situated with a lot of other city agencies, Young Men's Initiative, which is attempting to do something like that, or connecting the dots with other community-based organizations that can provide a range of programming and supports across a different range of challenges for a young person and or their families. But that being said, right, there still needs to be something that addresses what teachers, and not just teachers, right, because think about who else is inside of a school building every single day. Guidance counselors, social workers, your school safety agent is in there, and all of these folks are creating a culture, right, that may or may not be conducive, right, to young people feeling safe and wanted, and a lot of times it cuts right down lines of race and gender. So, yes, I do feel that, expanding expanding access is about addressing some of those implicit things. I would caution against the ways we begin to have that conversation around the structural barriers that are broadening school for the reasons I identified. And then, two, I think it's just to double down on something I said earlier. I think one of the things you were talking about earlier, which is, the sort of really short-termism that's pervading a lot of our education conversation right now in terms of results have to happen, and they have to happen now. And I actually had lots of arguments with my wife, who was a founding teacher and principal of a small school here in New York for about 10 years. And every time I get really excited about, trying to change something and make it happen, and she's always told me that, if you're in it to educate young people, you're in for a long game. And if you're in for a short game, you're in the wrong game. I think that's actually true, and I think to a certain degree, there is a tension between trying to improve a system at scale and the types of things you measure to make that a reality, because you are attempting to get to 1 million kids. And then the flip side of that, which is it is a long game, and how do you allow for things to sort of incubate? What are the spaces you can create for pockets of innovation to sort of thrive and not be squished, to then to really allow us to actually ultimately, as a Department of Education, to actually learn fundamentally what works and what doesn't before we make a determination around whether or not something is successful or not. And I think that's also part of the access question is we don't actually, we don't spend enough time actually getting down to what actually works and what doesn't, because I'm not sure we're really organizing super well to actually figure that thing out. And there are a lot of people who understand or say that they actually know what works. How many times have you heard that? Well, we know it works. Well, here's the question I'll pose then. How can everybody, right, know what works and we still have the outcomes we have? That's sort of a banana proposition, isn't it? If we all knew what works, well, we wouldn't have the outcomes we have, but we do. So there's two things that are going on. Either A, our egos are a little too big, right? We actually don't know, right? And then B, we're not actually creating the spaces for us to figure out, right, what it does know, because there are some other pressures, sometimes political and whatnot, which are real, and I'm not saying they shouldn't exist. They do, and they need to be dealt with. But there are those things that sort of get in the way. But around the access question, I really do feel, that's why a lot of my energy is focused on, people at the point of service inside of the school. What can we do to make them better, whether it's, addressing, the sort of biases they'll bring to the table, or strengthening their pedagogy, or thinking about ways that inside of a school building you can retool human capital for a different set of roles that actually begin to maybe lessen the burden on teachers. Right? What are other adults in the building? How can we actually begin to create different spaces where there are people actually specifically there for, right, to address social emotional concerns and expansion? And I think you can actually do a lot of this in a very in a sustainable budget, right, which doesn't actually require a massive influx of resources, but it's not really being super creative, and other policy barriers around labor contracts and whatnot. Yes, there are. We engage in those things, and those are also policy battles that need to be fought. But I think there are a lot of ways to go about it, but which aren't necessarily always about like, well, we just need more money, right? Like I said, I think people say that a lot, and that's fine. But we can do that and fight, and then we're having a socialist revolution, and who's going to go there? Not really, right? So we need to be creative and honest about what's really viable, and work on multiple fronts in terms of the political front, which is actually to secure more resources we may think would be better. But what are we actually doing now with what we have? Because if all we're doing is fighting the game that says we need more resources, and they don't materialize, then we just start taking our eye off the ball of what's going on day to day, and there are young people's lives that are there that need to be dealt with and served properly. So,
just could I say one thing? So the conference that John was alluding to, All Minds Matter, that we had this at the New School about 2 weeks ago. One of the people, Pedro Noguera, who's really an expert in minority education, told this story very briefly, which you reminded me of, that he was talking to the principal of Boys and Girls High School, and who unfortunately there's a lot of suspensions there. And he asked the principal, what do you think about that? And the principal said, we have no other option. These kids have a lot of emotional, social problems. We don't have counselors here, we don't have psychologists, we don't have guidance counselors enough for them. By the way, my first job as a professional was a school psychologist in New York City Board of Education. I got almost fired because I worked with kids. All I was supposed to do was test. So they have psychologists for testing, but they don't have clinicians to help kids, and that has to be part of the mix as well.
Thank you. So I think that to complement sort of some of the specific ways in which we can expand access that have already been raised, I think I would want to organize my response around three distinct sort of bigger questions or approaches that I would want to, that I think are important in determining whatever is done in the interest of expanding access. And the first is that I would want us to revisit the question of what is a quality education, in which we came up with very, very lofty concepts in response to that question, and think about what is the purpose of such a quality education, because I think that when we think about current policy initiatives, when we think about current expectations of schools and of teachers, the purposes of education are not always made explicit to everyone, and sometimes they're sort of assumed. And I think if the purpose of education is to prepare students to be part of a certain workforce, then what kinds of things need access and what kinds of things are prioritized are different than if we think that the purpose of education is to promote conscientization, as I said earlier. The interests and purposes are not the same, and therefore the things that will get prioritized as needing to be accessible to everyone will be drastically different. So that's the first thing. We have to think about what is the purpose of education and whose interests is it serving? And it's a question to be asked at every level. The second kind of point that I wanted to make is that I think that we should engage continually in the process of sort of reframing the conversation and thinking about what assumptions we work from. Meaning all of us who are part of this process, regardless of our role. One example of this is that it's particularly difficult to negotiate this tension between the statistics that we have and the reality, the very harsh reality of life for children in poverty, for example. Some of the very difficult realities that Warren was talking about. How do we negotiate those statistics and that reality, not in any way diminish the difficulty of living in these structural and social conditions, and at the same time think about students and children not from a deficit perspective. Think about children not in terms of what they lack and what they don't have, but what they do have. And one example of this is this very, very well-known research that Warren brought up regarding literacy and the number of words. And there's a lot of work that's been done on this. And there's this correlation between the number of words that students hear in the home and that are exposed to at a certain age. And then the students, so it's important for us to recognize how language is sort of operating in the home. And then at the same time, how do we think about those numbers in ways that don't frame the families in which less words are spoken as lacking literacy? How is literacy defined? I mean, literacy is very specifically defined in a very functional way when we think about like the number of words, right? What about the gestures that are read and learned that don't make it into those recordings? Like, there are many, many ways to be literate, and cultural literacies are multiple and rich. And we know, however, that those are not the kinds of literacies that are privileged and recognized in school. So how do we offer students the opportunity to have the experiences with language that will help them be successful in school, and at the same time not frame them as lacking, and see what they have in the home, the kinds of literacies that do exist in every home, regardless of how poor by economic standards, and bring those in as resources. And I think that's something that is often missing from the conversation that is very important when we think about what makes students feel like school environments are hostile, or what makes them not feel valued, makes the spaces not feel safe. And then the third point is to think about doing our own research. How can we, and meaning our own research, not just those who have the official role of researchers, but how do we get students and teachers and community members to really see themselves as researchers, to have the ability to come up with questions, to question the way things are, and then going about the process of engaging in investigations, method of participatory action research, as well as the concept and theory behind it. And I've been my work has led me to work with youth in introducing them to this concept of youth participatory action research. So conducting research on their own inquiries, things that are of interest and relevance to them in the ways that colleagues have brought up in different in different contexts, and then being able to see themselves as knowledge producers. What are the investigations that are relevant to me, to my community, and perhaps might generate similar questions in others? And how can I gather information, question the information that is out there that may not actually represent reality from where I stand as a person who's involved in the problem or connected to the problem, and then use data to do something about it. And the same concept is applicable to action research in the classroom as teachers. Right? All teachers have access to data that they can generate themselves. That, you know, on the ground, as you had, John had experienced, what it actually looks like when you try to teach something is very, very different. So rather than having a lot of mandates that come from the outside, you know, what does it look like when we, those of us involved, do our own research, and how does that then become kind of valid knowledge on which to become part of the research base that is so often referred to in our political context. So those are some of the kind of thoughts that I have about how to address this question, and I think that now we're just at time to get to our next phase. And while the logistical stuff is happening, I just wanted to thank everyone for their attention and everyone for participating on the panel, and then we look forward to the next part of the conversation.
I also want to thank you all for bringing your really unique and different perspectives on the issue. And now you'll have a chance to share your own thoughts with each other. So if each of the student facilitators, the fellows, could raise their hands, there should be one at each table. Questions for one, maybe questions for all. Yeah.
Is it John?
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could expand on technology in schools that you mentioned as an assist to.
Yeah, so if everyone didn't hear, the question was if I could expand on technology as an assisting to learning. You know, it's interesting. I've had a lot of conversations about technology recently because I think there's, with the proliferation of information, right, because of the IT revolution, I think there's some interesting things that are possible, and at the same time, some very nefarious things that are going on with technology. And so I would, specifically within an education context, I mean, I think technology, right, the way we've, at least specifically people on my team and some of the projects are working on, technology can actually, it's an amplification tool for a core set of fundamental beliefs and principles that you operationalize in your school. And technology can amplify things in a spectacular way, and it can also amplify things in actually a horrible way. Right, that's not conducive to creating positive school cultures and whatnot. So I've traveled around the country a little bit over the past couple of years, visiting different types of schools, looking at different types of school models. And if you've ever seen some where you actually see kids like in little pod chairs, and they just like zip around all day because they're accessing the entirety of the curriculum online and all that sort of stuff. Like, I think in some ways you can look at that as the most spectacular way to personalize a learning environment for a young person, because they're just sitting there accessing what they want to access by themselves all day. And they're literally by themselves all day on a computer. You can also think about that as like, well, that's actually, when it comes to some of those other things we were talking about in terms of a different set of social emotional learning skills, how to, acculturate in different contexts, it's actually a disastrous way that technology has amplified a certain set of practices. And so, I think technology, the way we kind of begin to think about it is, technology is an access to information. It has ramifications for the role of a teacher in a classroom, because now that the access to information is almost infinite for young people, it does, I think, raise questions right around what the role of a teacher should be in the classroom in terms of being content master or facilitator of learning. And then I think, quite frankly, it's necessary for technology to be, I think, to what someone said earlier, around it's really a tool for knowledge production and knowledge creation, right? And if you have a core belief that students demonstrating mastery of something through a task that has them creating new knowledge in the world, then technology obviously is a vehicle that can amplify that as a core practice. But if you don't actually believe that, then there are lots of schools all over the place that actually have computer labs that are empty, kids on laptops are not really doing anything engaging and rigorous. And so I think to a certain degree, technology for technology's sake can be a red herring. And so I would think about it in terms of, when it comes to school, what are your core sets of beliefs for education? How does technology amplify that for the better?
Yeah.
How can we connect colleges and universities to the educational system as opposed to leaving it in the other end of the spectrum?
This is a question that I think about a lot because I have found that there's a very big divide in many cases between what is considered theory and research and then what's considered practice, and to some degree also policy, right? So there are these different camps. And I think that number one, what counts as research, as I was talking about earlier, what counts as valid research plays a role in this, because there's a bank, there's like a research base, and then people dip into it and draw from it and use it to justify or as rationale for various initiatives, and there's often not a whole lot of participation between the research that was conducted and who conducted the research and what the questions were, and then how it's being used. So I think one of the basic things is greater dialogue and more facilitated and deliberate dialogue between practitioners and theorists, scholars, and researchers in thinking about questions together. And so now this requires a lot of flexibility and openness on everyone's part, because often the ways of approaching issues are very, very different. So this is one of the reasons why I really like to engage in participatory action research. And I've been delving deeper and deeper into it with youth as well as with educators, because I think this is one of those places where you sort of begin to change the epistemology of research and the epistemology of curriculum in school, to begin to think about yourself as a researcher also, not just as someone who can create knowledge as well, not just people who are over there. Anybody else?
I don't even know. I'm loud. Okay. It'll just make me louder. So through college and stuff, I've done my own independent studies and research and projects. In the college environment, it's easier to encourage independent studies and research and projects. But in probably the public education setting at the high school level, middle school level, elementary level, harder to do. So how do you encourage independent study and being able to flourish in one's passions and focus when you already have a set curriculum?
What's actually true in New York City high schools today is there isn't one, right? I mean, we don't actually have to teach. There are assessments, right, called a Regents exam that I'm sure everyone here is sort of beholden to. But in terms of what someone can actually teach, right, inside of and this gets at the crux between content-heavy Regents and performance-based more Regents exams that actually get at the sort of underlying skills that sounds like you were able to develop by doing sort of independent sort of study projects. I mean, I think the strange thing is that I actually think there are a lot of teachers out there who would like to teach in that way, right? Mm-hmm. There are a couple of things though. One, there is a policy environment that sort of precludes that. But two, it's actually very, very hard to do. It's very simple to say, by the time someone's 20 or 21 or 22, right, it's has developed a certain range of skills that can then do independent research on their own. That's cool. If you want to operationalize that as the gold standard for ways kids should learn when they're 13 or 14, it's actually ways that most teachers are not actually trained to deliver instruction, and so it's very, very hard, and so what that generates is a repeated sense of failure again and again. So I think it's less about the curriculum part of it, as more about the instructional delivery part of it, where it's actually just very difficult to do, and if we're not being explicit right around what we're attempting to do with the young person to develop a certain set of skills that they're going to need, then the failure on both part of the teacher and the student simultaneously just becomes a reason to be like, oh, let's give up and not do it that way.
If I could add on that, I think operationally, if most teachers would not report feeling the ability to teach what they want, I think there is a feeling, and not necessarily an incorrect one. There are frameworks, there are assessments. I know in our area we just had the state scope and sequence and the social studies framework released, and there's not on Tuesday you will teach this at 9 o'clock, right? So there's not that kind of lockstep, which we do see in some districts and communities around the country. But there's certainly a set of expectations of content, at least in my area, that we're expected to cover. And so teachers feel that pressure, and then they feel the pull, either through development or through their own natural instinct that they want to do things where the students are initiating learning and discovering new things. And that I see as one of the challenges for the pedagogue, which is, how do you balance this? How do you accomplish what you have to, whether it's for an assessment or for, because you honestly believe that they should know about history. A lot of history teachers, I can speak to that. There's value in learning about Emmett Till. You don't find it interesting, and that's our you should know these things. You can't know everything. It's a survey. But there's value in exploring things you don't know. I think one of the differences is, as you get older, you know what you want to explore. The challenge as the youngers, they don't even know the questions to ask. Because their experience is limited. They're 13. They're young. So there's a lot of challenges with teacher training and balancing that. And the best teachers can embed inquiry within the content, but it's really tricky, as you said. And so how do we foster that is the question.
I would also want to add that there's an equity and access issue here as well, because even though there is no set scripted curriculum, it just so happens that a lot of the students who attend schools with less resources, who have less positive reputations amongst other teachers, amongst their communities, who have, who are perceived, and whether this is true or not, the perception of like, this is an under-resourced school, this is a rough school, this is a difficult school, that student teachers don't want to go there, right? We all know that those schools exist, and think about who those schools are serving. And are those the schools most likely to have inquiry-based learning or more scripted curricula, right? And that's, I think, where the real issue of access becomes very, very apparent. And I think that in addition, kind of on top of the very real concern that you raised, which I agree with entirely, and it's the same in English language arts, that teachers feel this pressure to perform in certain ways. There are the accountability measures, even if they are meant to be formative and developmental, they don't necessarily always feel like that when they're operationalized. And so we have a lot of work to do, and I think that going back to the greater dialogue and partnership between researchers, policymakers, and practitioners would really be very helpful in having more developed partnerships between these different kind of roles in our teacher education programs, in our reform efforts, in all of these areas would help, because when teachers participate in the creation of a curriculum, they are much more likely to feel like they, ownership of it. And it could still be an organized and uniform learning experience for the students in that school, but they helped create it. And so that would be such a different experience than the student teachers and the teachers who feel like, oh, now English language arts is all about Codex, which is, the mandatory book that we've adopted, that my school has adopted, or that my district has adopted. That feels entirely different, even if the texts in the Codex book that I'm talking about, this is an English language arts text. It's not that there's anything wrong with them, but it feels very scripted.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing really quickly around this idea of action research. And I think it's a lot of times when educators hear this idea of action research or people coming to the building, it's a very sort of threatening thing where we're going to sit there and uncover, right, your what's going on inside of your classroom and blah, blah, blah. And I think this idea of action research, it's actually, I think this is one of the places where schools could actually be better, right? Participatory action research, like in Lean Startup, is called Build, Measure, Learn, right? In Design Universe, it's called Design Thinking, right? There are many actual places where this type of methodology of learn quickly, design thinking, it's, ideate, prototype, right, that sort of thing. And it becomes very, there's an opportunity there to make that sort of participatory action research exactly model the types of skills that kids are going to need when they actually get into the new labor force, right, which is now functioning this way. So if we're doing something together as a learning community that's sort of going through those build, measure, learn, right, cycles really quickly, you're doing research, but you're also actually modeling for kids skills that they're actually going to need. And I think it's an opportunity we're not seizing on very, very well.
Yeah.
Thanks. First, thanks for speaking with us all today. I really appreciate that. I also kind of want to ask a question about what John had brought up earlier when he talked about kind of the normal distribution, that there are good teachers and there are bad teachers. But I was wondering if that's actually even more difficult in kind of the culture we have today, especially the way we look at teachers in America. We have kind of this idiom of those who can do, and those who can't teach. And kind of thinking about that, and about if you have someone who's really good at math and they end up not being a math teacher, rather they become a mathematician, and we don't have people wanting to be teachers, and we don't necessarily look at teaching in a prestigious way, and maybe how that affects the quality of the teaching.
I agree. I think teaching has taken a hit. I call myself the teaching cheerleader because I so love my job, and I love it 22 years in, as much as I did when I started when I was 2. And it's this incredible thing, and it's a question that I feel, and I think that we have an obligation as schools and teachers and leaders to foster that discussion within our communities, but also with institutions of higher learning. Like, how are we showing the positives of this job, of this this vocation? And the teachers, there's a spectrum of abilities as in any career, but I will say that almost 100%, they really love what they do. And even when they're doing things for the test, I'll hear things from my teachers like, they're concerned about content and they're stressed, and they'll say, I want to do this thing, but what if I don't teach who John Hay is, and then that's on the test, and then they don't get it and they fail, and that's my fault. And it comes from a place of deep-seated concern for doing right by children. And so I don't know the solution, but I think it's a greater conversation that we have. Programs like Teaching Fellows, which one of my friends is starting as a mid-career change right now, and I'm so excited for her, because I think that's what an incredible thing. And twice she's thought about it, and I've been there, and so it's a case by case. But then how do colleges do that? We have a high school in Queens for teaching. So it's a greater conversation. It's a very political conversation too. But to think about the rewards of that and being able to spread, so that's part of our obligation. How do we invite student observers in? How do we invite the student teachers in? How do we train? How do schools commit to that? How do cities commit to that so that we can to support that and against all the rest of the negative stuff?
One quick thing. Oh.
Who gets the mic?
You go ahead. You go first.
Yes, is teaching sort of gotten beat up in the political fights? True. I think one of the things that's sort of underexplored is that, if you look at some of the research as to why people eventually leave the teaching profession, it's, sometimes it's about pay and things of that nature, but it's actually, a lot of it is saying it's really about opportunities to kind of grow and evolve still within the field, right? And I think one of the things that's really bizarre from my point of view, about the teaching profession, is if you think of the range of skills that actually go into that job, they're so wide-ranging that it's almost impossible. No other profession wants you to be like, I'm a great writer of curriculum. I'm a great constructor of learning experiences. I'm a great constructor of connecting with young people. It's like, what other job is asking people to do those sorts of things? So, if that's the case, why can't we begin to think about differentiated pathways through those sort of different jobs? How can you do it at scale, right? So if you're, every teacher has sort of had this moment where they were awesome at 2 parts of their jobs and sucked at the other three parts of their jobs, right? And so why am I putting you in a situation where you have to suck at those 3 parts of your jobs every day? Just make you do the 2 things you do best, and now let's think about how we retool human capital to the other person who does those other 3 things really well. That's your job, right? And then can we do it at scale, and how do we begin to network schools together, right? To say, if I'm an awesome, performance task writer in math, and I work at Forest Hills, well, can't that be my job, and I do it for your school and for other schools? And then there are people at, the schools who like to actually be in front of kids every day who deliver reading instruction. That's a very basic example, right? But we can clearly be more creative, right, around some of these things. If it's possible to imagine it, it's possible to do it.
Just quickly, I think that those who can't teach do. I mean, it's very similar to what John was saying. I think that the expectations of what it takes to teach are so diverse. I completely agree with you that it's almost impossible to imagine that one person could do them all. And I think it has a lot to do with the way that we understand professions to work and the way that we understand the disciplines. This is especially the case in high school, where the content area discipline is so important. Because students will come to the teaching profession in secondary and say, well, I really love literature, and I want to be a teacher because I want to impart this love of literature. And at some point during the process, then they become it becomes aware that they're going to teach students, not literature. And so being an expert in your subject is very, very important. And the best teachers are very, very good in their content area. Just as good as anyone else who goes all the way to the highest degree in whatever subject. But they also have this other quality. And I think that as a society, we have this kind of emphasis on being the best in a quantifiable, marketable, kind of lucrative way, that we recognize these levels of expertise as if they're, the be-all and end-all of any profession, and, to the detriment of then being able to recognize what it really takes to do. And I know this certainly affected me when I always wanted to be a teacher, and I always loved English, and I did not choose education at the beginning because of this socialization that those who can't do teach. I specifically chose from the very beginning to get my degree all the way to the master's in my content area. And it wasn't until I really began teaching that I understood how misguided that was. And then decided to change paths and pursue education. And so I think that, as we begin to sort of question that, the way that things are structured in that way, we might be able to reverse some of that thinking.
If I just can add on, if we look at one of the biggest changes in New York City, to begin, I think, if not so much the success, but the discussion, the new teacher contract that came out has stressed in the memorandum of agreement, which is one of our big things in the pre-K to 12 level, is this idea of teachers designing their own professional development and becoming researchers, becoming part of the conversation, trying to find what they're doing best at. I feel like it's in a very, very infant stage, but the language, it's the first time there's been language like this. And teachers are really struggling with it, at least where I am, right? Because it's empowering, and that's scary. And it's something that if we talk about biases, how am I as an administrator approaching that? Because that can be scary for administrators too. Because when you empower, like when teachers empower students and they get to do stuff, that's very scary. But I feel like there can be this culture shift, and it's happening. The discussions are beginning. So it's about fostering that across the city, and then in each school, how do we take these ideas as researcher to foster this and build that within the leadership that will help teachers recognize their best capabilities and then apply them appropriately.
Just a quick comment. It just seems, if you look at the public dialogue around teaching, it seems so punitive towards teachers. That, they need to be evaluated, they need stronger evaluations. What about discussions about they need pay? I wonder what it would be like if we paid our teachers like Norway, Sweden, and Denmark pays their teachers. What kind of results we'd see, what kind of people we'd see teaching. Anyway, just a random thought.
So we are at our time. If there are more questions, I mean, we can.
One more.
I've been waiting for. All right, we'll do the last question.
This is for you, Warren. Everything is about power. He who sets the agenda and gives out the money controls things. We have probably more of a minority stakeholders here in New York City. But those who set the agenda and give out the money are disingenuous politicians who are more concerned about being reelected and blaming somebody else. And they choose their handmaidens, the Board of Regents, Merrill Tisch and stuff, it's all the 1%, and they don't have quite the stake. What would you think of doing an experiment and our Board of Regents be made up of parents who sat there and cried in the lotteries that they didn't get? Parents who sacrificed to go to a parochial school and they had less food, and they were decision makers. Do you think we'd have a different setup of education in New York State?
Yes. Great idea. And let's all march now. Seriously. It made me think, popped into my head, I have a friend who's named Maya Wiley. She's a counsel to de Blasio. And she told me she loves going to work. Why? Because she can do a lot of things, obviously, but also she walks into a room, and this is the de Blasio administration has purposely put this together. The 12 people that are his, sort of his kitchen cabinet or his cabinet, they represent the city. They represent the city, and that's what we need in the city. That's what we need in the Board of Regents.
So we are actually out of time, and part of why I'm being the stickler about this is that while each one of our panelists is doing something different, what they all have in common is that they are super busy, and we really thank you all for sharing your time and your ideas with us. This is really an incredible discussion with lots of different perspectives and a lot of food for thought.